Governor Scott Walker, he's the talk of the political class. Could he be the real thing? We're back with our panel. Charles.
Well, look, he has the attributes you would want for this kind of race. He has appeal to the Tea Party, has appeal to the more establishment Republicans. We're not talking about a senator. We're not talking about somebody who makes speeches. He's been a governor. He did something really important. He took on the unions. He did it at very high risk, high cost. He won 3 elections himself. He won 2 others which were indirectly about him, a recall election and a state Supreme Court election. He won 5 elections against all the union money in the country. So he shows he can win, he shows he can govern, he shows he can handle hard issues. And now people are looking at him to see, you know, what kind of candidate, how he presents himself. He gave a good speech in Iowa, and that, I think, has sort of rocketed him out of the mass.
Mara, an important caveat here as we talk about polls. You have this poll in Iowa, Des Moines Register poll. He's ahead there. You have a poll in New Hampshire. He's ahead there. But these are obviously very early.
It's February 2015.
Yeah, exactly. So
let's remember that.
It's important, and the numbers are pretty low.
Yeah.
That said, he got a lot of attention in a short time.
He did. He's battle-tested, as Charles just described, and every one of those fights gave him a widening circle of donors and people to, you know, tap for this presidential race. I think the big question is, if there's an establishment lane and a Tea Party lane, and he wants to bridge both of those camps, can he emerge as the competitor to Jeb Bush? If Jeb Bush is the predominant kind of establishment figure right now, who's going to be his competitor? And I think right now it's Scott Walker.
Yeah, I think in some respects this isn't that surprising to see Scott Walker do this well. It's surprising maybe to see him do this well this early. But I think for people in Washington this comes as a little bit of a surprise because they haven't been watching Scott Walker's career. But this fits the Scott Walker narrative. If you look at how he emerged in Milwaukee, he won election as a county executive in Milwaukee County, heavily Democratic county, and he did it because he came in after a pension scandal. And he said, I'm going to clean this mess up. And he did. He goes to Madison, Wisconsin, runs for governor after his predecessor, Jim Doyle, the Democrat, massive spending, big deficits. And he goes to Madison and he says, I'm going to clean this up. And he did. $3.2 billion biennial deficit is gone. He now wants to come to Washington, and he's making the same argument. I want to clean this up. Washington is a mess. I'm the guy to do it. In
a dangerous time overseas, without any foreign policy experience, is that a big problem for somebody like Scott Walker?
I think it's certainly a challenge. You know, when you hear him answer questions about this, he likes to point to the fact that he's the commander of the National Guard and that he's gone on these trips. That's not going to be enough in these cases. I think he's going to have to do some real study and show that he's conversant, that he's fluent in these issues, that he can answer these questions without pausing and hesitating.
George?
Most politicians' books aren't worth the paper they never should have been written on in the first place. Scott Walker's actually written a good book. It's called Unintimidated, and it tells in granular detail about the riots and 100,000 people and the death threats and all the other stuff. They said of Grover Cleveland, we love him for the enemies he's made. He's made enemies of public unions that are looting the tills of state and local governments, and everyone in America knows this, no matter what state they're in. And in the recall, he got to know every major Republican donor in this country. He has probably the best mailing list, up there with Jeb Bush's, which he inherited on his own.
The trick for a GOP candidate is to win a state that went in the blue column last time. Can he do that with that resume of taking on public unions in places where unions maybe are popular?
Well, he just did it in one of them. 18 states and the District of Columbia voted 6 consecutive times for the Democratic candidate. One of the 18 states is Wisconsin.
I think the argument that he'll make is if I can do it in Wisconsin, I can also win Michigan, I can maybe win Pennsylvania, the kind of Great Lakes region. That's what he's offering. Midwestern, mainstream, but conservative, who has appeal in blue states.
And your question about the foreign policy issue, there's no way that you can have a candidate who can in any way speak authoritatively, unless he's been Secretary of State, which of course Hillary will have been. But you want a governor if you're a Republican. That's exactly what the country's looking for, and I think that's why Scott Walker has an advantage over, for example, Marco Rubio or others in the Senate. We have tried senators like Barack Obama, and we see what happens. But I think you can make the argument if your fluency is extremely important. You don't have to have achievements in foreign affairs, but you have to know what you're talking about.
Ronald Reagan.
Yes, exactly. And he was fluent, and he also had ideas, and he knew how to implement them. But I think if you're running against Hillary, which of course will be likely, she is going to tout how much travel she did. She has no record in foreign affairs, and the Obama overall record is going to be a negative one. So I think it actually be, ironically, an advantage, even if you have a governor who doesn't have a record in foreign policy.
Who would you compare him to, Steve? Like another politician people would be familiar with. I mean, is he Tim Pawlenty on steroids? Is he, who is he?
That's a very good question. Let me answer it in the negative. He is not Tim Pawlenty. I mean, I think this is where so much of kind of official Washington or the establishment had Scott Walker pegged wrong. They thought he was Tim Pawlenty. They expected him to come out and be boring, to not make a very good splash. He goes to Iowa. He gives what I think, you know, what I would regard as one of his better speeches. I've seen him give better speeches than the one he gave in Iowa, but it was a very good speech. And because he so far exceeded the expectations of people who expected him to be bland and dry and boring, he catapulted to the front of the pack in Iowa, in part because I think the voters there in Iowa and conservative grassroots voters across the country have been talking about Scott Walker for a long time. As George points out, people were following his recall very intensely. When I go and speak to conservative groups around the country, almost always one of the first questions I get is about Scott Walker. It's about the recall.
And you know, one thing we haven't talked about much is one of the attributes, you have to have some ideas. And this is going to be a race on the Republican side to see who is the conservative reformer, you know, the reformicons. And Scott Walker has a pretty strong argument to make that he actually did it. He did it in 2012 and 13 and 14. Jeb Bush will argue he did it long, long time ago in Florida. But Scott Walker has a case to make there.